Step in. Tune in. Lights up. We begin.
In Motion presents The Sports Lab, where we discuss all things sports performance, with Sian Thomasson, sports podiatrist, and Damien Walsh, sports performance coach.
This is The Sports Lab.
Welcome to episode 2 of The Sports Lab with myself, Damien Walsh, and Sian Thomasson.
Hello, back again.
Yeah, we're back. So, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about ideas for the podcast or ideas for some social media posts, and I thought, why don't I just ask Sian loads of questions?
Thanks. Put her on the spot.
So here we go. It's quite a mixed bag, and some are quite bespoke to like her interests as well as qualifications. So here we go. Given your experience with the London Marathon, what are the most common foot or lower limb injuries you've seen in marathon runners, and how do they typically present?
The most common injuries I probably see with the marathon distance runners, and it is different depending on what distance we're talking. So if we're going to be specific about marathon runners, I would say probably Achilles tendon issues. So Achilles tendinopathy. Plantar fasciitis in all runners, right? That's just a given.
I'd never heard of it before.
What, plantar fasciitis?
Yeah, and now I've had it in left and then now I've got it in my right foot. Yeah,
it's really common.
Sorry.
And then probably shin splints or metatarsal fractures, stress fractures.
Yeah.
In the marathon runners. There are other, obviously, that where do you stop? There's loads of injuries, right? So you can have knee injuries, IT band issues, things like that. It normally comes with marathon runners as a gradual onset of pain, as opposed to a sudden incident of injury, unless they've fallen, but that's quite rare. So that's normally they're the most common injuries that I see, really, and it all tends to be due to repetitive strain injuries, repetitive training, and some biomechanical problems, especially for new marathoners.
I would say like shin splints, like from my experience, is more from new runners that have gone too hard too soon on hard ground.
Yeah, probably in the wrong footwear.
Yeah,
and probably, like we've said a million times before, without the right strength training. Yeah. So biomechanically, something's not working right. You don't get shin splints if everything's working perfectly.
How can a runner tell if their injury, e.g. heel pain, shin splints, is biomechanical rather than just overuse? And what role does a gait analysis play in your assessment?
It kind of leads on from question 1, doesn't it, really? Yeah. The biomechanical aspect is where the injury keeps reoccurring despite trying to treat the injury. So you get an injury, you rest it, you see your physio, your sports therapist, you do all the things, and it gets better. Okay, it's an overuse injury that will get better when the load is reduced. So you stop running for a couple of weeks, the problem resolves, right? But as soon as you return to running and the injury comes back, it's going to be a biomechanical issue. Yeah. So they're probably the main difference. And where does gait analysis come into that is really valuable. It's the most valuable thing, really, because we can look at so many parts of that running cycle. The foot strike patterns, degrees of pronation, supination, cadence, stride length, upper body alignment, arm swing. There are so many variables within that. And then we can see the differences, the inefficiencies, the asymmetries, the overloading of the foot, leg, and the whole body, really. So without the gait analysis, you couldn't almost really ever fix an injury, in my experience.
I agree. There's a lot that can be learnt.
Lots. Everything.
For plantar fasciitis that hasn't responded to standard rest, stretching, icing, when would you consider using a steroid injection, and what are your pros and cons for an active runner?
Right, steroid injections definitely have their place, and I do them relatively often. But it has to be used in conjunction with other therapies, right? It's not a quick fix. Well, it is a quick fix, but unless you solve the underlying problems and the reasons why you've got it in the first place, the steroid might work for a little while and then your problem's going to come back. It's the same as I've just said. Plantar fasciitis is an overload injury, right? So unless we get used to the fascia loading the weight in the correct way, we could get rid of the discomfort with the steroid, but the problem is just going to return. So when would I consider a steroid injection? Really would be if all other treatments have failed up to that point. So we have corrected the biomechanics. We have looked at the striking of the heel, the way things are loading, and we're still having issues. Then I might consider a steroid injection, and I might do it strategically, to get someone through a certain event if we've got one coming up. But it's not really the first port of call. So you wouldn't walk into my clinic and I'll give you a steroid injection on day one. So it's got its place, but we need to correct everything biomechanically first, and then they work nicely.
I've heard surgery can help with certain chronic injuries like neuromas or severe bunions. What conditions do you most commonly treat surgically in runners, and what's the recovery timeline to return back to running?
Yeah, I mean, most runners will tell you that they will not want to have surgery. It's very unusual for a runner to want to have surgery. So it really has got to be last kind of resort for us as clinicians, but actually for the runner as well. And probably in a future podcast, we'll get one of our surgical specialists to come in and talk about this in a bit more detail. But I would say the most common issues we would treat surgically for runners and sports people in general would be neuroma, Morton's neuroma, potentially bunion issues, but maybe more hallux related issues, so toe off issues, and kind of the niggly things like ingrown toenails. Again, they're a bit more prevalent in your other sports, so like your footballers, for example, but you do see them in runners and they're chronically painful and agonising. So they're the kind of things. Now, if we're talking like ingrown toenail surgery, recovery is easy, right? 2-4 weeks, no biggie. But if we're talking the things like neuroma surgery, then obviously it's going to be a good 6, 8, 10 weeks off of running, which you tell a runner they've gone on a run for 8 weeks and they're not going to want to do that. So it's a real long-term issue. And footwear as well. So people get fasciitis, and those that are not aware tend to go into the most unsupportive footwear known to man to try and get in their heads relief from the fasciitis, but they're the unsupportive, soft, crazy footwear that then to cause the other problems like neuroma. So it's often, and that can be the same with sports. So you go from wearing running trainers to shoving your foot into a small, tight cycling cleat, and you could potentially set off with the wrong biomechanics, things like neuroma. So yeah, you see it all the time. I would say I see it more commonly with the shoe change, but that has a bit of a hand in hand with footwear, and especially things like cycling cleats because they're so narrow as well.
That kind of relates to the question, which was how important is footwear choice for injury prevention?
Footwear is the key, and I think I must say that phrase about 900 times a day, and anyone that's ever seen me as a patient that's probably laughing because they know that I say that a lot. Footwear is the key to everything. If your footwear is wrong, your whole biomechanics can potentially be out, and there is not one shoe or one brand that I will say suits all, right? It's all, everything's specific. So human body is different. So therefore you could say every shoe should be different. It's not as easy as that, but we can definitely, we need to be specific. There is no way you'll come to me and say, oh, I've got, plantar fasciitis. And I'll say, right, every single one of my plantar fasciitis patients should wear a Hoka trainer. Like, it's not as easy as that. So I have to look at the whole biomechanics before I will recommend a shoe type that will fit into that category. So that's what I can bang on about trainers, as everyone knows, for a very long time. Let's do a whole pod on that.
Trainer episode.
I've got a whole episode just on carbon fibre trainers alone, so we might be doing it for a while.
With your background in working with elite performers like the Royal Ballet, do you see similar biomechanical patterns in runners, and what crossover advice do you give your foot strength and flexibility?
Yeah, it is really interesting, that crossover. I do have experience in dancing myself, as well as working with the Royal Ballet Company, as you said, and other local dance performance colleges. They both, ultimately, runners and dancers have a lot of repetitive strain injuries, especially if we're talking runners that are running big distances. So your regular marathoners and your ultra marathoners, we are looking at repetitive high loads being put through the foot and ankle. And they rely to do that on their intrinsic foot strength and their ankle stability. So that's the same with dancers of all dance and runners, right? The most important piece of information with regarding the crossover, if you like, is that you need to focus on those intrinsic muscle exercises. Yeah. And ballet dancers particularly, but all dancers and a lot of the dance colleges are absolutely fantastic at doing those intrinsic muscle strengths, right? You wouldn't get a professional ballet dancer that's not working on those intrinsic muscles every single day. Yeah. But yet your runners won't. So we need to try and make sure that our runners are doing those short foot focused exercises to maintain the ability to cope with the repetitive high load.
I've got a question that wasn't written down, but
oh no,
it's associated with that. I believe that there are lots of tiny muscles in your foot, and just like any muscle with strength training, they can grow. So therefore, might your feet grow, and might you need to adjust your trainers or footwear when you develop foot strength?
Right, I see the logic behind what you're saying, but it doesn't quite work like that. Just because the intrinsic muscles we're talking about are small, right? They are tiny. So yes, if you work on them, they will massively improve your biomechanics and really help your foot deal with that repetitive load. But are they going to grow to the point where you can't put your trainers on? I doubt that. Well, it just won't happen. No, the answer's no. You're not going to be a bodybuilder of feet.
My feet have got abs.
Love that.
For a runner recovering from a stress fracture in the foot, how do you approach gradual return to run protocols, including any orthotics or injection support? Okay,
stress fractures are really massive in mid-distance runners, I would say, more the long-distance runners. And I have seen it quite a lot over the years. And I have to say predominantly in women. That's probably hormonal based and bone strength based. But obviously the priority is to get it better first, right? You have to have that bone healed. If that bone is not healed, we're going to end up with chronic problems. So we have to make sure it's healed first. But then with returning to work after that, it is important to get impact to encourage healing as well. So there's a very fine balance between healing and returning. And we would definitely start small with walking. Yeah, so walking progressions, walk-run intervals to begin with, and then gradually slow mileage. Orthotics absolutely would be helped to redistribute the pressure, because we have to look at why you had a stress fracture in the first place. There's a biomechanical issue, and as we said earlier, you don't get any of these injuries without a biomechanical issue, right? So we have to look at why you had the biomechanical issue in the first place. We need to correct that. Absolutely, orthotics 100% have their place, as does, what am I going to say? Trainers. The right trainers for the injury. So it's all about starting small and gradually growing, going big, rather than being off for 12 weeks with a stress fracture and smash you're back into a 10k the next week. So it's kind of just about gradual return to and being sensible. No runner's sensible. But...
No, I think I think it might have been you I was speaking to the other day, and I was saying if you go to the GP with any sort of injury, they'll be like, rest, recover. But a runner will very rarely listen to that advice. And if they do, they'll just won't. I don't know. I think runners are creatures of habit. And if they were told to stop running for like 2 weeks, there's a chance they might not pick it up again.
Yeah, and I think there's also a mental health issue related to that as well, isn't there? You know, a lot of runners will say, especially again, mid-long distance runners, they're going to say a lot of the reason why they run is actually not just the physical health, it's the mental health aspect as well. And if you then say you can't run for 8 weeks, that's not just going to affect your physical health, but it does affect mental health for a lot of people. And it goes back again to what we were saying earlier about if you completely stop doing something and then go back to it, actually, if you haven't looked at your biomechanics, the injury is probably going to return anyway. Yeah. So it's not as easy as just go lay off for a couple of weeks and everything's going to be hunky-dory.
What are your thoughts on minimalistic versus cushioned running shoes for someone with recurrent foot issues, and how does that interact with biomechanics?
So this is a conversation I could do another whole podcast on. But minimalist shoes are really specific. They are a life choice, shall we say, as opposed to a functional support.
But we were never designed to wear footwear in the first place, were we?
Correct. But we also were never designed to cope with the terrain that we have now to deal with. Like concrete, for example. And the majority of your everyday runners, a lot of their friends that we all know are going to run around the block because they're probably parents and they've only got half an hour in their day to go for a run. Where do they run? They run around the street, right? That's a concrete pavement. So it's a very different environment to maybe what you're talking about millions of years ago when we, walked around forests and stuff. And it also comes down to strength training, right? So, now, these days, with the lifestyles that we have, we don't do the strength training, and our foot structure and foot muscles are not strong enough to cope with it. So therefore, minimalist shoes and like the barefoot running type stuff, if you're going to do it, you're all in or you're all out. There is kind of no mix in between the two, because it's such a foot structure related thing. So yes, it massively impacts on your biomechanics. If you want to go for barefoot running, you have to work at those intrinsic muscles, like some of our professional ballet dancers we were talking about earlier. They're really the only people that are ever going to survive without injury wearing a barefoot shoe, or a minimalist shoe, should we say. So cushion shoes are also the same, and I think probably somewhere between a minimalist shoe to highly cushioned is probably the majority of people. But there are some people I put in a cushion shoe. It all comes down to biomechanics, injury history, training goals, future events, blah, blah, blah. So it's kind of not as straightforward to give you one answer.
How do you treat Achilles tendinopathy in runners, and is there a point where you recommend surgical options like debridement? So
Achilles tendinopathy is a tricky one, right? Because of the way, again, we can do another whole episode on this if you want to, but the Achilles tendon itself is such a major functional part of the foot that without it, or without it working 100%, is going to cause most runners issues. But we have to be quite careful with it because of where it's situated, its blood supply and the anatomical structures that are around it. So we can't go too hard too soon. So it's about progressive loading, right? So it's about returning to progressive loading to try and help ease the stress on it, and slow and heavy resistance put through that with exercises, as opposed to pushing it really hard. But you also need to look at the other structures around it, because again, if we've got Achilles tendon problems, we don't just have Achilles tendon problems, we have an issue somewhere else. So we have to look at kind of calf strength, ankle mobility, which is a massive one, foot biomechanics, things like that. So there are loads of treatment options available. For Achilles, there's injections, there's steroids, there's obviously all your stripping, taping, orthotics, the right footwear, blah, 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 and surgery. Now, surgery, I don't think any surgeon, and tell me if I'm wrong, surgeons, but would say Achilles tendon surgery is a good idea in a runner, without exhausting absolutely everything else first. And it all comes down to where Achilles is and its anatomical structures around it. So I couldn't tell you the last time I saw someone go for Achilles surgery as a runner.
Runners often get calluses or corns from friction. Beyond basic removal, how do you address underlying biomechanical cause prevention reoccurring? So yeah,
like you said, it comes from excessive pressure or friction in a specific area of the foot. And again, like you said, it's all to do with biomechanics, right? So there has to be an underlying reason why that has happened into that area. So it all comes back down to gait analysis again, biomechanics, looking at biomechanics and foot pressure scanning to look to see where those high pressures are and why they are there. Most of the time, if it's a significant amount of corn or callus that's causing pain, it could be, for example, changing where that pressure goes in that part of the foot. So redistribution of pressure, shall we say. Most of the time that will require an orthotic. But definitely footwear again. Footwear adjustments, getting the right footwear to put the pressure in the right area. Padding is okay, and you can do offloading padding for a short-term fix. The other thing we're doing now is filler, so foot filler, hyaluronic acid injections into areas. It is more of that is not correcting biomechanics, right? That is literally just a cushioning for...
Putting a plaster over the problem?
Basically, yeah. Now, for some people, that's actually still better than fixing the biomechanics, because the biomechanics may be so complex that it's without maybe major surgeries, that's hard to correct.
So putting a plaster over whilst they work on the biomechanics.
Yeah, sometimes. But even sometimes you can't fix all the biomechanics, right, without maybe some surgeries, which maybe the patient doesn't want to do. So you're kind of trying to find something that, you know, in theory, you can get everything to work pretty perfectly. But in practice, life's not like that, right? So, you know, maybe I've got a patient at the moment, you know, that does a lot of sport, a lot of all sorts of sports, mixed sports, has horrendous, painful calluses, is only young, and also has just had a small baby. So, you know, he's not really in a position to have, you know, 3 months putting his foot up while he's recovering from surgery. So it's about keeping him active, having a home life, a life outside of work as well, and keeping him comfortable. So this is the best fix for him. So it's sometimes about trying to do that as well, isn't it? It's not about always getting everybody perfect. It's about trying to make people be comfortable and still do the things they love doing.
What's your approach to verrucas, plantar warts in runners who can't afford long downtime? Do you have accelerated treatment options?
Yep. Is the short answer. I mean, there are hundreds of verruca options these days. It's quite unusual that you will find verrucas in runners that are painful. You see it occasionally, but it's quite unusual. Downtime treatments, I mean, anything's got a downtime, right? But yeah, I mean, things like needling, you could get away with not running for less than 24 hours and then go back the next day. You know, even our acid-based treatments, you can still run on that. Yeah. So it's unusual, again, unless you're doing really significant treatments, which is quite unusual for verrucas, actually, that you would need a lot of downtime.
But if a runner has persistent foot pain, what treatments like padding, orthotics or injections do you find most effective?
It's a combination of all of the above. Strapping, taping, padding is my quick fix, right? Yes. So if we're halfway through an ultramarathon and we've had an ankle sprain, okay, I'll tape it, right, to get someone through to the end. But you can't tape that foot for the next 6 months, right? That's not the cure, right? We've got to find the reason. So normally it would come down to orthotics. Yeah, we have to realign that foot from the base up, as opposed to trying to stick it with some tape. It's more of a short-term fix. For
ingrown toenails or nail issues aggravated by running shoes, when do you recommend nail surgery, and what's the recovery like for someone training regularly?
Again, depends on a lot of factors. If it's, you know, are we talking like marathon runners, ultra marathon runners, or are we talking about someone that's doing a 5K? It's so different. It's so varied. But basically, if it's causing pain and it keeps reoccurring, do it because it's never going to improve on its own. If it keeps reoccurring, if it's the first time, that's a different kettle of fish. But if it's coming back every 6 weeks and we've got chronic infections in it all the time and it's also painful, maybe it's stopping you doing a race, then I would say just get it done. Downtime wise, I would say a few days. And I'm being really vague just because every person's different, right? So if we are talking about your average healthy person, there's nothing wrong with, they could probably go back to progressive, small, short runs quite quickly. If it's, you know, there's medical history related, then we might be asking them to go longer. So it's all very subjective. And it comes down, again, if we're talking about specifically for runners, how long am I going to be able to persuade a runner to not run for? So it's kind of we have to work together to come up with a solution.
How does poor foot biomechanics contribute to knee, hip pain in runners, e.g. runner's knee, IT band syndrome? Can orthotics help upstream issues?
Yeah, so foot biomechanics are, again, are the key, really, and they definitely have issues. They cause issues further up that chain. Yeah, so overpronation, for example, and this is just one example, could cause internal positioning of the knee, right, or pressure that's going through the medial side of the knee, which will therefore influence the alignment of the knee, and therefore, as you're putting pressure through that during running, can cause things like runner's knee, IT band syndrome, some stuff like that. So an orthotic would massively help with that, because you can just realign where the knee position is at heel strike, which will then take put the knee in a better alignment and therefore take away the discomfort. So orthotics is really important and can absolutely cure a lot of problems much further up. So knees, hips, lower back, and even spine stuff. So yeah, orthotics have a massive part to play.
What self-management strategies do you recommend for runners between appointments to maintain foot health, like specific exercises or home tools?
Well, we've probably worked it out from all the other questions. Well, what I'm going to say, but it comes down to muscle strengthening, doesn't it? Yeah. So every runner should be, or listen to me now, should be doing intrinsic muscle strengthening. Yeah. Maybe we should put a link for some kind of exercises.
It wasn't until I'd done some strength and conditioning for runners, like with a specialist, that I genuinely didn't realise how much my foot could fatigue so quick. 10 to 20 to 30 reps of something, very small movement in the foot, and my foot was just like so tired. It couldn't do any much more than that. And you just think, hang on a minute, like you've got to use this foot to run for 3 hours if you're like 3 to 4 to 5 hours if you're running a marathon, longer if you're running ultra. Yeah.
And bear in mind, if you're fatiguing in your foot but you're still running, you have to use your bigger muscle groups to be able to continue your run, right? Yeah. So what do you do then? You fatigue those muscles, you end up with injury or repetitive injuries from them, and you get a slower time, right? Because it's going to slow you down. So if we can improve intrinsic muscle strength, then we potentially can prevent the bigger muscles from fatiguing and therefore maybe increase your time. And all runners want to be faster, right? Have you ever met a runner that doesn't want to be faster? So basically it comes down to intrinsic muscle strengthening, but calf, Achilles strengthening is huge as well, right? If Achilles isn't functioning well when we're running, then we really are a big risk of injury. And again, fatigue. So we need to do those ones. So it basically comes down to load training. Yeah. So weight training to some extent, strength training. And what can you do? You can do that at home. You don't need to go to a gym particularly for that. Resistance bands at home with maybe just a couple of small free weights, or even if you haven't, body weight. And I know PTs that do Zoom classes that you can do it with just bottles of water. So there is almost no excuse. But I think people are not maybe sure about what to do, how often to do it. So that's where we come, both of us come into that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, people just need some direction, I guess.
Absolutely.
There's so much on social media and YouTube, but what's the right thing for you at the right time, and how many reps, and what is the weight, and what is the resistance, and there's two. So if you actually speak to somebody that can spend some time with you and direct you, give you some guidance, that's so valuable.
And we know that everything online, there is some really good things online, but there's also some really awful things online. And if you don't know anything about it, how do you distinguish between the two of that? So like everything in life, go to someone that knows.
Exactly. Where's the quality control?
Yeah.
With your extensive NHS surgical training, how do you decide between conservative treatments, e.g. orthotics or injections, and referring for or performing surgery?
My answer to this will have changed over the years. If you'd have asked me this 20 years ago, I'd have given you a completely different answer. And that is predominantly from working with sports podiatry now that has changed my mind. Because I think as in surgery, I think our aim and our thought process always goes to surgery, right? That's what we did all our training in. That's what we can fix you because we can do surgery on you, right? So I think it's a natural reaction for surgeons to want to do surgery. Yeah. But actually now I've worked with a lot of runners and a lot of sports podiatry in general. I would switch that completely the other way around. So conservative treatment is always the first line of defence in my experience. And as we said before, you can do surgery, lovely, easy, straightforward. But if your biomechanics is still wrong, you're going to end up with another injury or be the same one back again. So you have to look at the biomechanics first. You do things like your orthotics, your physiotherapy, your strength training, your sports therapists, your injections if you need them. Get that all working. Get your biomechanics as good as you can get it. And it's never going to be perfect, but let's get it as good as we can get it. And then, okay, we're still having problems. That's when I will refer.
Have you noticed any trends in running injuries post-pandemic, e.g. from sudden increases in mileage, and how has that influenced your advice?
Yeah, I think running made a massive surge, didn't it, post-COVID? I think people suddenly decided to take up something so they could just get outside. So I think running definitely increased, and injuries therefore increased because people didn't have advice. So they just went out, probably in some old trainers they had from 20 years ago, because they couldn't go to the shops, couldn't go to running shops and whatever. So I think it was a lot of injury from that. I think it's all about balancing, isn't it, with making sure we go small first. You know, we don't suddenly set off, never running before, to do a 10K on day 2. So it's about general mileage increases, strength work again, making sure we're doing that strength, always appropriate footwear. You have to have the right trainers, as I bang on about all the time, and making sure we're keeping up to date with it, and we check it again. Yeah. So your biomechanics today might not be your biomechanics next year if you do loads of strength training. Yeah. So it's about, and even I would say that with gait analysis, you come to me and we do your gait analysis. If we change things, we do your strength program, we put you in orthotics, we change your running trainers. Actually, let's reassess it again in a few months' time and redo that gait analysis, and let's compare the two. Because if we don't, how do we ever still improve? Yeah. Because there's always improvements that can be made.
For injured runners worried about re-injury, how do you tailor your long-term care plans to balance in training goals and foot protection?
Obviously, care plans are always going to be individual, yeah, depending on so many factors. It's a really hard question to answer, to be honest, because it's so personal. But we obviously, again, would look at everything. We'll look at the whole biomechanics. And as sports podiatrists, we don't just look at the foot. I know that's our predominant area of expertise, but you have to look at the whole body system and the whole biomechanics of all things, as well as looking at what distance are you running, what terrain. That's the other thing we have to think about, right? What terrain are we running over? Are we doing road miles? Are we doing road marathons? Are we doing trail running? Are we doing fell running? So many different factors that can come into play. So care plans are very varied, and I would say I can't give you an exact answer on that one.
What key information from my training history, shoe type, mileage and symptoms would help you create the most effective individual care plan?
Well, kind of just goes back to what I just said. I need to know everything because everything has an impact. So I want to know weekly mileage and any changes within that. So are we training for a marathon and never our weekly mileage is changing? Or are we only able to run around roads 3 days of the week, but the weekend we go fell running? Like, I need to know that because that will affect different muscle groups. The shoes, what trainers are we running in? Bring them with you if you come and ever see me. And I've had people bring whole bags of shoes to me, especially our big runners that, shoe rotate. So type and the age of your running trainers, that's massive. Surfaces, like we said. I think any even previous injuries. Yeah. So 20 years ago, you had an ankle sprain. Like, I need to know that because it could massively still impact. And obviously, what symptoms are you having right now? What symptoms are we dealing with and how do we correct that? So any information, no matter how tiny, and people often go, oh, I forgot that. 3 years ago, I broke my second metatarsal. Like, that can have a massive impact. So I kind of need to know it all. So that we can add it all up to tailor that treatment to make sure it works for that person. So again, very individual. Also comes down to age of person and health of person. Are they trying to lose weight, or actually is it the opposite? We're trying to bulk. So again, they can make a massive difference in what load we're putting through the foot, how and why we're doing it.
I guess your body responds to what you do.
Yeah, 100%. And that can be good and bad, right?
Exactly. Yes. Lack of movement, lack of strength training will negatively impact, and too much or poor strength training or too much or overtraining will negatively impact. So you just need to hit that sweet spot.
100%.
That's it for episode 2. Thank you for answering all those questions.
No problem. It's your turn next.
Can't wait.